Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event at Cutler's Hall at Sheffield Doc Fest. My name is Rebekah Polding. I am the inaugural Director of Archive, Heritage and Exhibition at BAFTA, and it is my delight to be here today with a fantastic and distinguished panel who I will introduce to you in just one moment. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here. I didn't expect this in the middle of a festival filled with all sorts of documentary delights. Sometimes you think, well, where do archives fit in? And shining a spotlight on archives in this way is just, for me, as a former film archivist, the most important thing that we could be doing. So I'm delighted to see that you all agree with me. Our archives are the most fantastic resource for creativity, for learning, for knowledge, for human interaction. That we invest in them and continue to preserve them is so important. The work that our archivists do to make this content available for us and for future generations is often unsung, and it's very nice to have this moment to spotlight that incredible work and commitment and say thank you to them. And if there are any film archivists out there, very personal thank yous to you too. When I first got the title of this panel, Innovation in Archive, I thought that's a bit strange. I hear that a lot. Over the past 10 years, I've worked with quite a few different schemes, projects, panels, conferences, all of which have brought these two terms together. And in some ways, I think that bespeaks a certain anxiety that archives, that word, does not sound new. It doesn't have great PR value. The word dusty is unfortunately often coupled with it in a way which is not helpful or appealing for anybody. And I think sticking the word innovation there is a bold attempt to say, look, these things still matter. But I think there is a deeper truth as well, that every time you take a piece of content from an archive and somebody sees that, it's in a new context, it's a new interaction, it's a new time, it's on a new piece of media. There is an innovation there, and these innovations continue to proliferate at speeds which are, frankly, extraordinary. And this, like so many others in preceding decades, is a time of enormous change. The power of digital, the power of coupling an archive with the internet, the number of people that can be involved is now out of this world amazing. And the panel today have all used very different approaches to bring some of this new potential to bear on archival content in different ways. So it is my pleasure to begin this discussion by introducing first on my left here Lindsey Hanlon, who is a BBC Arts project lead based in Glasgow, who produced an Artists in Archive residency at the BBC Scotland and has worked on a range of artist projects for BBC Arts. Next to her, we have Catherine Allen, who is a bit of a Sheffield Doc Fest regular. She was on a jury last year looking at all sorts of digital projects and previously worked with Touch Press, a non-fiction app producer whose project Disney Animated won the Audience Award last year. So I'm sure the festival are particularly delighted to have her back. But today, we are pleased to have her on the panel as an independent digital producer whose work Easter Rising uses archival material in a VR context in an exciting new way. And finally, on my extreme left, we have Stephen Smith, who has literally just flown in from LA this morning. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your hardiness. Stephen is based at the University of South California Shoah Foundation, and he is the producer of New Dimensions in Technology, which is also showing at the festival, and I will remind you of when and where you can see those at the end. We're going to start with a brief presentation from each of these guys about the work that they've been doing recently, and you'll have a chance to get a flavour of the ways in which they've been using archive. We'll then talk a little bit and gradually open it up to you, so do start thinking of what you would like to ask the panel. And Stephen, I believe you are going to lead us off.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Stephen Smith. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the USC Shoah Foundation and the archival content that we work with. Some of you may have been in the Millennium Gallery and seen the interactive with Pinchas Gutter. This is Pinchas being filmed in Los Angeles 2 years ago. And we also have the pleasure and privilege of the fact he's sitting right there. Pinchas, say hi. Stand up and say hi. We're going to see a lot of you in the next 3 minutes. Okay, this doesn't go into a dusty archive. But Pincus didn't only speak for 5 days about his experience in Los Angeles in the light stage, he also gave a testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation 20 years ago, and about 25 years ago to the Toronto Holocaust Museum, which means there are 3 versions of his testimony in our archive. So what I want to talk about is, what do we do with all of that? Digital preservation. Let's start right there. Content, lots of content coming in. 90 terabytes from that interview with Pincus alone. So we focus, first of all, on preservation. There's lots of data. It comes in. Sometimes it's coming in on U-matic. Remember U-matic? It's coming in on DVDs, on DV cams. It's coming in on 6K. It's wonderful when it does. Lots of data coming in. So we ingest it, analog and digital. Once we've ingested it, we create JPEG 2000s of the whole lot and 20 different derivatives of that for different purposes. It goes into our preservation unit. We do bit-level preservation, and we preserve onto tape, on the data tape. And what we're interested in there is ensuring that we're doing preservation by migration. So lots of tapes, 5 petabytes of tapes, actually, in our archive at the moment. And my clicker's not working. There we go. It goes off to our storage unit. It looks a little bit like that. Lots of data tapes with a robot. What we're doing, we're checking those tapes every 3 months. If 1 pixel in on one testimony of 2.5 hours drops, 1 0 turns to a 1, a 1 turns to a 0, or vice versa, we know that because we have a thumbprint of the whole file. We then restore it from the cloned version of it, and we throw the data tape in the trash, and we start over. And we have 4 different versions of the full archive for redundancy purposes, 3 of them in the United States and 1 of them in Prague. As well as that, we've cloned the whole system, and we also work at the moment with a number of partners, including the Academy of Motion Pictures and Warner Brothers, where we look after all of their video files. Oh, there we go. So back to the Visual History Archive. We have 53,000 testimonies. We collected them in 63 countries in 40 languages. The last one was Quiche from Guatemala about 3 weeks ago. 112,000 hours of material. That breaks out at 12.8 years if we were to sit and watch it here, 365 days a year. You access that through 63,000 keywords, about 55,000 of which are geographical place names. We have 700,000 images in the archive also, as well as 1.8 million names. So who's watching it? About 6.5 million people last year hit play on our archive somewhere or other, and 15 million connected through social media, and about 500 million saw that content in some form of documentary form last year. That doesn't count what happens in museums and exhibitions and so forth, of which we have about 150 using our content right now. The archive gets used at university campuses, 532 courses at the last count, and 155 works that quote it. So what is the Visual History Archive? Well, that's it. It's a search for interface, basically. You'll see on the left-hand side here, we have different collections: the Holocaust, Armenian Genocide, Nanjing Massacre, Genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and they're coming in thick and fast right now. But if I put in the word Majdanek in here, you'll see there's 820 testimonies of people that were in Majdanek or talk about Majdanek. If I then put in Kolditz, a POW camp, you'll see it's gone down to 2. And if I press next, you'll see that one of them is Pinchas Gutter. There we go. That's a surprise. There's Pincus. That's his page in the archive. And you can see here that we have segments. These segments are 1-minute slots within the archive itself. And each segment's got keywords in it. So we search by keyword within the archive. In fact, there are 6,734,760 segments, all of which have been indexed by a human being in one of the 40 languages. It's a lot of segments. You can also take a journey with Pincus's testimony on Google Maps, because every instance of a place is also indexed. So those are the places that Pincus was in during his experience. You'll also see here we have an index. This is like the index in the back of a book. Attitudes towards, we're on the A's here. That's so you can scroll through and find subjects that may be of interest to you. And here you've got people. Rumi, Dorothy's daughter, Sabina, his twin sister, who he lost in Majdanek, and Tanya. So in fact, his other daughter. All you see there is all the names of the people that he talks about in his testimony. What do we do with it? We curate it. This is an educational site. It's called Eyewitness. It has just 2,000 of the testimonies. You find activities like this. I choose this one on the Armenian genocide because it's relevant to our DocFest. This is based around a documentary filmmakers collection. J. Michael Hagopian collected 440 testimonies of Armenians across a 40-year period, making documentaries. And so what you have when you go into the activity in this education site, you have outtakes from documentaries, which are the content which the students then explore. So these are just 6 outtakes here, but then they can do, having explored those outtakes that have been curated into the lesson, they can then go into the archive itself, and I haven't put the screen up here, but they can then clip the archive, save into the site, and remash the content. This is an icon. So the question is, what's next? We all got to see this image a couple of years ago, which Joshua Oppenheimer brought into our lives, which I thought was, an image that wouldn't be surpassed until we saw this last year. And I know that Joshua keynoted last year. So obviously behind both of these films is the documentarian himself. And here he is with 2 of the protagonists, the perpetrators that appear in the film The Act of Killing. So what's happening right now with our work with Joshua is all of the content that made up the documentaries that ultimately were made. For example, before he came across this character, Joshua interviewed about 45 perpetrators. None of that has been seen or screened because they don't appear in the movie. But all of that content exists. So what's happening now is, as a part of his work as a filmmaker, and those of you who are filmmakers know there's a before, during, and after. And the after bit of this is, so what do we do with all the content so it just doesn't disappear, but actually has a life beyond the movies themselves? Which brings us back to Pinchas and the New Dimensions and Testimony project, because those 90 terabytes that we collect in 1 week are only just a part of the story. And our question is always going to be, and why we're here today, what we're here to talk about is, how do we ensure that our archives, including our digital archives, are not dusty relics in the past, but really play a role in the future too? That's me.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Much food for thought. Catherine, would you mind introducing us to your project, please?
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine. I'm currently working with the BBC as a freelance producer, working on Easterising Voice of a Rebel with the BBC Learning team. We're premiering Voice of a Rebel this DocFest, but I'm going to speak to you more broadly about my experience working with Archive at the BBC as a producer, but then also previously having worked at Touch Press, which is a non-fiction app production company. So just a little bit about my background. I started off my career in factual production, but then moved into the world of tech, working at Touch Press, making iPad and iPhone apps. We produced apps about things from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, all the way to Disney animation, which I'll talk to you a bit more about later. And then now I'm at BBC in the learning team, as I said, producing Voice of a Rebel. So I'm going to just show you the trailer now for Voice of a Rebel. It's a VR experience for Oculus Rift, and it explores the Easter Rising from the perspective of one man and his memories. So, Voice of a Rebel we've been producing it since autumn last year with the brilliant production companies Vertov, based in Australia, who Oscar Rabi is the creative director of, whose work has previously won Sheffield Awards, and Crossover Labs as well. So there's a very much creative collaboration between the 3 organisations. And where it began was when Oscar and Mark were in a bar after a gig, and they happened to get talking to the band's lawyer, who was saying that his family had fairly recently found a tape in the attic, as you do, of his grandfather talking about his experiences of what it's like to be 19 in the Easter Rising, swept up, and living through it as one of the rebels. So I'm just going to play you a little clip now of the beginning of it, which is the prologue, where we do include some archive in a more traditional sense, but you'll see. So what happens next is that the user sees some more traditional archive. They see it appear pictures of the Unionists and the Nationalists in 1916, pictures of propaganda posters from World War I. They get a sense of the context of the time. But then we start to hear more of Willie's voice, and we then embody him and experience the events of Easter Rising from his perspective. So we go back onto the streets of Dublin when he was on his way to the races, actually. He thought it had all been called off. And he gets swept up by a friend of his. He says, it's on. And off we go. The next thing, we're in Liberty Hall. After that, we're in the GPO, and the GPO is evacuated. And through a twist of fate, William Knieve survives when the rest of the group that he was with, the rest of the rebels who were evacuated, were all killed by a British barricade as they were evacuating. So the piece, what we were going for initially, what our goals were, was to see what we could do, very much an experimentation, so as much a virtual reality experiment as a virtual reality experience. We wanted to see what would happen when you combine history and VR, and use archive as a bridge to experience somebody's memories. Now, something you've probably seen here in the style of it is that it is in no way photorealistic. We wanted to interpret his memories, reinterpret his memories, create an artistic interpretation around them in a computer engine called Unity, which is often used for games, actually. We wanted to create this very stylistic representation and see how creating this archive interpretation affects people's experiences, engagement levels around history content. I'm now just going to talk to you briefly about Disney Animated. It's an app that we produced in 2013, 2014 with Disney when I was at Touch Press, and I was head of marketing at the time. And it was in Sheffield last year in the interactive exhibition. And it takes you through the history of Disney animation and how they evolved their craft. So all the way through, includes like early sketches, early Mickey Mouse sketches, all the way through to Frozen maquettes and CG animation. So you can create, for instance, your own Frozen snow special effects using a Frozen snow engine, which we created inspired by the actual technology that the Disney team were using. So that was a collaboration with Walt Disney Animation Studios and the Animation Research Library. And we got to get our hands on some very exclusive content, archive content that hadn't really been unearthed before. Here we go. This is the homepage here. And it just kind of shows you all the different parts of the app. So you've got all the way from how the story is set out initially, scripting process, storyboarding process, all the way through to special effects and music and distribution getting out. And it tells you how films are made now at Disney, but then also how they would have been made as well throughout time. And then we've got these hands-on interactive sections, as I was saying, so you can create your own Frozen snow animations, you can animate Vanellope from Wreck-It Ralph and create your own Vanellope, share your own Vanellope animations and movements. And then we've also got, this is quite interesting from an archive perspective, this piece part of it called the color map, which is each of these lines is a film, and we took one screen grab every 6 frames, and then took an average of the colours in that frame, and then put all those lines together to create this colour map of each film. And then we put all the films together as well. And so you can scroll your finger along it and hear the soundtrack and then see the frames as well. So it's a very sort of quite quick snapshot way of experiencing the whole of Disney's feature film collection. So I'll be drawing from those references in my conversation today, and I'll probably be focusing on virtual reality and apps as my frame of reference as well, and what the potential is there. And something I'm very interested in with archive, and the angle I always come at it is how can we make archive more accessible, especially more accessible to a younger audience, and how can we make it more engaging as well using technology. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Lindsey, would you mind telling us about your project, please?
Yes, of course. Well, I shan't stand up because I don't have a presentation. I've got some clips which we can show. But yeah, I'm based in BBC Scotland within BBC Arts, and in 2014 I led, developed and produced an artist and archive residency with a number of colleagues, which invited artists to apply to take part in a 6-month residency and production process at BBC Scotland with the outcome of creating a new artist film work. And it was really one of the first times that there have been some tentative explorations with the artists in the BBC archive before, but this was very much quite public-facing, open application process. So it was, I think, the first sort of really formalised process for artists to come into the BBC, experience life as a producer, with all the resources that comes with, but at the same time, the expectation was on them to create a work of art. So we had, in the end, 6 artists, Luke Fowler, Torsten Lauschman, Alia Said, Catherine Elkin, Kate Davis, and Stephen Sutcliffe, who all created quite extraordinary and quite divergent artworks using the BBC archive as their starting point. And the artists were encouraged to use their own material as well, so they could use specially shot material, but really they were drawing on the archive as the primary source for their development. So that's that, talking of frames of reference, that's the project that I come here with today. And I think there's a lot of, whilst it isn't an interactive project, it's very much a kind of linear film in a sense, which we premiered in Glasgow and at Tate Modern in London, and then they went to live online on the BBC Arts website. I think they do offer interesting approaches to archive and also that kind of sense of the creative potential of archive. And I think they also demonstrate the importance of artistic intervention. Those artists, I think, really came with a new syntax, a new vocabulary, and a new language for film, which in television we often, use a very recognisable language and syntax, and especially within documentaries. So they really did, I think, kind of wipe the slate clean. So I've got 3 clips just to offer a bit of a kind of outlook really on what they did, and hopefully it gives you an insight into the films, which you can of course access online to see in their entirety.
Thank you. It's a shame that we can't see all of these projects. So a very straightforward question to begin with for all of you, just to give us sort of some more shared frames of references. With the huge resources that have gone into all of these projects that keep the Shoah Foundation's petabytes churning, that the BBC have, that brought to bear on the new technological developments and so on, of virtual reality, you could start from scratch. You could just film the content that you want. And this is at the heart of all documentary filmmaking. Do you create anew, or is there something that you need before that? Could you just each briefly say why you used archive as the starting point? Why archive? What does that bring for you as creators? What does that bring for audiences who get to see what you create? And should we start with you, Lindsey?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, and from the BBC's perspective, I think we as BBC Arts are very keen we work with artists all the time. This particular project was brought about by a motivation to commission new work. And in a sense, we recognise that the BBC sits on one of the greatest archival resources in the world. I mean, it is our acrylic paint and oils, it's the material and medium that we work with on a daily basis. And it's an incredibly valuable resource. I mean, it mounts to almost 1 million hours of footage and counting, not including written archives, sheet music. I mean, it's vast. And so for us, this was a way of unlocking that and inviting artistic perspectives into the archive, which wouldn't normally have access. So in a sense, I think rather than the artist just creating new work, this was about letting them into quite a kind of precious and fascinating resource.
So it really started with that archive and a way of bringing it to more people in a way,
Absolutely.
opening it further.
Yeah.
Catherine, I think you more or less said that was one of the big motivations for your project, the finding of this archive.
Yeah. And also the Easter Rising as a subject matter. We're very interested in those untold stories from it. The story of the Easter Rising tends often to be told from the perspective of the leaders. When this recording was found, what was great about it when the team found it was that no one really heard of Willie McNeve before. There's not much about him, and he was a very ordinary lad who afterwards went on to have nothing to do with politics after he was interned in the internment camp in Wales. He went on to lead quite a normal life. So we were quite interested in the fact it's an untold story. He's could be considered fairly ordinary and relatable, and bringing that kind of story to a user, combining it with virtual reality, we think there's a lot of potential to explore history in a really, really new way. So I suppose why use archive? Here it was creatively we wanted to explore what happens when you take archive and innovate, I suppose, in terms of format in virtual reality.
I'm interested that you talk about this being the untold story, that very democratic approach, that the stories that we want to hear now are those very personal ones. Would you say that's a particular strength of VR and that very immersive, subjective
Yes, the
format?
thing about VR is that you really have to have a role to enjoy it properly. You have to know as a user when you put your headset on, like, what am I doing here? Why am I being plonked here in this environment? So personal testimonies work very well because you can live through somebody else's memories and the role that you play is as them. So yeah, I think that's probably why untold stories, personal testimonies work well with VR as a medium, yeah. And actually, there's another piece in the site gallery at the moment, another VR piece, alongside Voice of a Rebel, which is called the Notes on Blindness VR experience.
Has anyone seen that at all? Oh, a couple.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's next to our piece, actually. And that takes a similar format in the sense that it's one man's experience of going blind, and it takes those tapes and creates, reinterprets those memories in a very artistic style. And it's that kind of embodiment element that we were really interested in, I suppose. Yeah, embodiment meets VR.
So you're starting with a very authentic embodiment and giving people that opportunity again. Stephen, I'm guessing that authenticity is probably one of the key words for the Shoah Foundation's wish to preserve actual stories and find new ways of sharing.
Yeah, I think there's also there's kind of a quadrant, if you like. There's, on the one hand, there's living history at a time when you can document people while they are alive, and the purposefulness that one goes about that is has one dynamic to it. Once it no longer is living history, for example, with the Armenian collection that we have, what we're doing there is we are purposefully now looking for those fragments of memory that, you know, exist in various quarters, and all we can do is gather that together. Where you then get an interesting tension, where it's living history, is the difference between documentation and documentary. One being an art form, and one being also an art form, but a different form of collection, in which we're not trying to tell a particular story that's in our mind and in our treatment and on our storyboard, but actually is allowing each individual to tell their story in their own words for as long as they would like. And with the understanding that later on that will then get curated in multiple different ways. So, interesting enough, we do both. So we are involved in documentation, but we're also involved in documentary. And we go about those in completely different ways. Everything that we collect while making the documentary goes into the archive, but we actually put it in as alt media.
Okay.
So then it becomes an additional source.
So you have a very clear organisational distinction there.
Between the two.
Right.
Where it becomes very interesting, and the reason I put Joshua's project in the mix this afternoon is that then when you look at the work product of a documentary film, there is so much around it which actually is archival if it then is treated as such. And I don't think we've paid much attention to that, the amazing work the documentarians have done while making their documentaries. that can also be and should be considered archival because it contains so much material yet to be explored.
Was any of that involved in your project, Lindsey?
Well, I was just touching on that. I think that's an interesting point about rushes, you know,
Right.
in Joshua's, because actually in the BBC, rushes haven't always been, you know, sort of archived. So in a sense, that's very precious material to be able to kind of work with a filmmaker and actually archive the whole project, because, you know, the artists that came on the project that we were working on sometimes were looking for rushes and they couldn't find things because they were no longer there. And now I think the culture has shifted. Things are being put onto LTO tape, and you know, rushes are archived. But when you think that there's, you know, 1 million hours of footage archived, that could be multiplied several times in the amount of stuff that's being thrown away, you know, which is...
Imagine all the rushes of all the films that are here at Sheffield
Yeah,
Doc Fest
I
if
know.
they were somewhere to look at.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting in the case of Michael Hagopian because, you know, he's quite a strong director, so he would say that again, say that again. So you've got this genocide survivor who's just describing, you know, the fact that their mother had just been killed, saying it 4 times. But of course, each time it's different. So you actually get different variations on exactly the same story, which actually is interesting in its own right about storytelling and how you go about that and how you construct the episode in different ways. So, you know, we struggled about, do we put all of that in? And then with the foundation that represents that archive, we decided it would all go in so we could actually see the whole process of the storytelling.
Which is perhaps a privilege that your organisation has, which not all organisations share. I've been involved in similar discussions with the BBC about rushes and about what can't be kept. We have the same at BAFTA. Policies have to be set, limits have to be created. And then I think you do find that there's an interesting sub-economy that grows of the people who find it in the skip, or the producers who keep it, or the camera woman who has her own archive of things. It's an interesting part of what we keep, the organisational and personal histories of what we decide is of value at a particular moment, perhaps. That raises an interesting question about challenges for archive drawing, for what you would need to keep to draw on. Catherine, can you see challenges coming up, given the new uses that you want to put this material to? Or did you encounter challenges in finding this material?
Yeah, with VR, one challenge was, of course, this is a subjective experience, and when you're dealing with a topic like the Easter Rising, which is still quite a sort of a sensitive topic, there's a lot of different opinions around it, it's quite controversial, and also in England, many people haven't heard of it. So the views on Easter Rising are wildly varying from like very, very strong to no view whatsoever, have never heard of it.
The challenge of irrelevance is a pretty big one
Yes.
for material that you're keeping for an unknown future.
Yeah, completely. Yes, there's a challenge of irrelevance. There's also the challenge of the ethics around placing somebody in somebody else's memory. Because the thing about VR is it gives this illusion of presence, that you are there. It goes from, instead of watching something on a rectangle screen, we then enter that space. So there's a lot of ethical challenges around that, which cross over with archive challenges, which are, if you're living through somebody's memories, is it ethical to put somebody in those memories to see things from that person's perspective still? When, you know, if they're a rebel in an uprising, then what they're doing, there's a violent uprising. A lot of civilians died in that experience. So saying, oh, live through these memories, it could be perceived as taken the wrong way. When actually, as long as, the way we tackle this, as long as we keep it incredibly sensitive from both sides, we include lots of context as well. We made sure that we were very aware of like current political situations and got lots of advice from Northern Ireland colleagues, for instance. We think we've come out with something that addresses that. We experience them through somebody's perspective, but they're also contextualised by it being a learning experience as well, and they're learning about the political, social context of the time and the other person's point of view.
Which is interesting, what else you need to save with each piece of content, isn't it? I mean, I think you've just brought a keyword up there for me. I expect it's in other people's minds as well, is one of the ethics. How do you respect an original piece of content, the people who made it, whatever purposes it was made for, and its new moment of reception? Do either of you guys want to share some of your thoughts on that?
Do you?
Or
Yeah,
both,
I mean,
hopefully.
certainly it was a very interesting experience doing Artists in Archive, because Catherine had experience of this as well. It's just the nature of the BBC as an institution. It has an institutional voice and standards and lots of considerations that viewers aren't necessarily aware of in terms of how it makes documentaries and the kind of editorial policy surrounding that, and bringing in very individual voices of artists and their own vision. That was a meeting of two cultures, really, which was very interesting, and allowing the artists the kind of total freedom, which we wanted to do. We wanted these to be unmediated works. It did still raise interesting questions within the organisation who aren't used to working with, completely. There are a few, obviously, lots of free spirits, but artists are very used to working completely on their own. Like, they don't work within institutional kind of, environments. So, Torsten particularly was the last clip that you saw, was querying truth and querying, belief systems. The couple that you saw in the footage was from a programme called Man Alive in 1972. They thought they'd seen a UFO. They thought that very seriously, but Torsten, in a sense, is questioning that. He's questioning their beliefs, and he did so throughout his work in a quite a playful way. But it opens questions. Is it okay for that footage to be used in a work which isn't a documentary? That couple signed an agreement to be in a BBC documentary about, the kind of supernatural, UFOs, whatever. And then, is it okay for Torsten to use it? Well, we thought it is, because it is a BBC project, but...
And is that something you have to have discussion about?
Yeah, definitely.
Was that with the artists or internally? Or would you
Both.
ever consider going back to the people in it or the original producers?
To some extent, we did try for some, and in some cases we did, to say, we're making this, would the person be okay with us including this footage? And generally, people were fine with it, it was okay, but it was certainly something that, as an archive, I think the BBC holds very dearly, is that sense of responsibility to those that are within it. So, which is also great for the artists, because their films are now very protected within the archives. No one's going to pillage them for shots and things, But yeah, the whole thing raised a lot of interesting ethical questions, and yeah.
I wonder what it would be like for that couple seeing this work now, how empowering, how valued their experience would feel, and how disorienting.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I once released some material to a cinema that wanted to screen a load of local footage to a local audience, and they didn't tell me in advance that they were going to allow a projectionist to put a comic voiceover on it. Very obvious, very clear example of the sort of ethical considerations that even what seemed a very non-innovative practice should have been on the alert for.
So, yeah, our particular archive is fraught on many levels. As you can imagine, being based in Los Angeles, it had a whole gaggle of Hollywood lawyers constructing the release agreement, and we can do anything with our content. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should.
With a Hollywood lawyer.
That doesn't necessarily mean that we should.
No.
So we think very carefully about each version of the archive itself as a whole and the policies that we apply to it. We still send notifications when we're going to use content of somebody that we know is living, or maybe not. Still, the last known address gets a letter. So in fact, when we launched the education website that I showed you, we put 1,000 testimonies there initially, and we sent letters to all 1,000, and we had 2 people come back and said, I would rather not. So it gave us an indication of the sort of the level of acceptance that, and it helped us to then guide the policy that we were going to apply, which was, actually, it seems that the subjects are really comfortable with this. So we're doing this incrementally, and sometimes we get some blowback. It's very rarely from the subjects and their families. It's usually from misuse of the content in some form or another. So we've been very cautious about that. So for example, with the use of the content in an educational setting, we do allow students to remash the content.
Right.
But it's behind a wall.
And are there limits placed on that mashing?
They can't share it outside of their virtual classroom.
But they can do anything with
They can do anything with it,
including the comedic voiceover.
but they can only share it within their virtual classroom. Now what we're doing, we're lowering the walls a little bit more so that now a virtual classroom can be one class of kids, or it can be 1,000 kids that have joined a class group. But still the content gets shared within the group, not onto their Facebook pages yet.
Right.
But what we're doing, we're looking at that, and we're looking at practice, and we look at and then we make policy decisions and business rules around what we're seeing practice is. And if we find we're in a position where we're uncomfortable, then we just don't continue to explore that. And we've learned a lot through that process, and so we just consider, but the principle behind it is that these aren't life histories; these are people's lives. And so we treat them as lives, as if they were, and we look at it through that particular lens. It makes us a little bit more cautious than we sometimes would like to be, based on the advances in technology that are available to us. But it also means that when we do then pursue something, we've thoroughly tested it, gone through some incremental change, seen what the results of that might be, and then we can then scale.
I mean, it's very interesting the way that each of you have pushed at your own archival boundaries in what you've done. You know, wanting to reach new audiences with the new technologies that have become available to you, like a virtual classroom, VR, letting artists loose. It's pushed, and it's created a really interesting conversation in terms of workflow and practice, as well as in terms of the end product. I just wondered if people had any thoughts themselves about the ethics involved of using this material and or similar archives in innovative contexts, because of course this material hasn't been necessarily deposited with these views in mind. Has anyone seen anything or heard anything that has raised these issues in an interesting, positive or negative way? Gentleman at the front.
I'm currently making I'm currently making a film on Concorde, and one of the ideas with the film is to use completely new footage, but based on archive footage. So we actually kind of remap some of the original footage. So the footage is actually all 4K, but it's the way that the camera behaves is exactly how it behaved on the original footage. And obviously that could raise some ethical issues, but because all the shots that we're talking about are confined to the aircraft in motion, which you can no longer film, obviously, we thought that that was an ethical line that was fine to cross.
And you've done that for technical reasons to produce 4K?
Yes, yes, and to produce a film that allowed people to see that subject through fresh eyes.
Interesting. And it sounds to me like you've gone through a certain process of discussion about this. What were the concerns that you had?
Well, I think the thinking behind it is that that there's an awful lot of footage of Concorde that people are very familiar with, and it's become almost a visual cliche. So we were keen to make all the footage have a particular visual style, and also make people see it afresh. And as I say, because the people in the film, by the way, are just our own audio interviews which accompany the footage. So it has a sort of lyrical, artistic kind of reimagination, I suppose, of the subject matter. But it did make me think that if documentary goes this way, then that there are plenty of subjects where it could get ethically quite tricky.
Yes, I suppose Concorde has a fairly neutral starting point in that, in the way that perhaps some of these other subjects don't. But I'm interested in this formatting question, because of course an archive's guiding principle is to preserve things as they are when you get them. And that principle has been completely transformed by born digital materials where things are always just in flux. How do you negotiate the difference between how something was made and that being part of its content in a way, you know, like a lovely scratchy bit of Super 8, and the new moment and the changes that may be required? Some people want the Super 8, some people want the 4K. Stephen?
So we have an interesting one just right now about animation in VR. And there's a particular story we want to tell in a VR animation. So what we're doing, actually, we're starting out with the archival of the individual telling the story. So we establish the persona and the voice.
Right.
And then we're going to be using the audio track from the testimony as the storytelling behind the animation, and then returning back to the testimony at the end to re-establish the individual. So we had this same sort of debate about why recreate the scene in animation, but it's for a younger audience, and we want to engage them in that particular way.
We had a challenge there, yeah, because we would have loved to have included the original recording of Willing and Eve, and that was recorded on a cassette tape in 1978. So as you can imagine, like the quality is not to modern standards. But we really tried, and we cleaned it up to scratch as much as we could. But it's still, when you put it into a VR context, because virtual reality is just like so immersive, there's so much coming at you. It was another kind of challenge for the user's brain to have to get round, which is like to listen to what he's saying, get through the sort of the hiss of the cassette tape. Also, his delivery was quite sort of matter of fact. In the end, we had to make quite a tricky decision between, do we do that, or do we revoice it by an actor and give the user, audience member, an anchor point to which they could come back to, the sort of, you know, the clothesline that you hang off your story illustrations from, and do we give them that? And in the end, we chose, because we wanted a similar sort of challenge, and where we came up with a similar solution, which we wanted to make accessible to younger audience. We wanted to make it something that could quite easily be understood. So we went down the route of how we've got Liam Cunningham, Game of Thrones fame, to revoice it, and we think we stand by that decision. We think it's turned out pretty well, but we're pleased that, you know, of course, it's his original words.
So just one other PS on that. So we had the same dilemma with the interactive, and we had this discussion with Pincus probably 4 or 5 years ago. So the question is, once you've captured this digital image, there's so much you can do with that digitally. But we've made the decision we're not doing that. We've created a clip bank, and so the natural language processor is accessing the clip in full. We decided that we weren't going to animate the transitions,
Right.
so that effectively we're keeping each clip in full, intact, in the full answer that Pincus gave to each of the 1,000 questions that he was answered. So sometimes they're very long. But
Pincus, we are grateful for your patience.
Yeah, but it's we feel it's not our role to intervene in the explanation that he gave to any given question, but just provide that verbatim. So effectively what you're doing, you're using voice commands to interrogate and pull clips from an archival source, which then present themselves back to you in full.
And you're allowing people to sort of see that device laid bare by having no transitions, by having a pause between questions. So you're not completely trying to present them with the illusion that Pincus is there in person.
That's correct. We could animate that,
Yeah.
all of that, but we've made a decision not to because we feel that it keeps some of the authenticity of the original material, and it doesn't go into the grey area of saying, well, you've manipulated the subject. What we're saying is, this is a bank of clips. You talk to the system, it'll find you the most appropriate clip, and if it's 5 minutes long, then you're just going to have to sit through it or hit stop. That's your choice as the viewer.
And I'm sure that that is exactly the right decision for now. Not that it's my place, I'm not judging you, but I'm interested, you know, perhaps in 50 years' time, like Catherine, future users of this content might find that future audiences have such different expectations of an experience of what media should be like, that someone may have to revise that decision and may have to completely animate this experience. Lindsey, I wonder what you think about this, because with these guys, and to a certain extent with your content, the archive material is there as a piece of history. It's authoritative, and that's why it's being brought forward into this new context. But it seems to me that what you've been doing, and with your artists, what's being brought forward is an emotion or an aesthetic experience, where perhaps the constraints and possibilities are different around formatting and how you would present that.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
No, I would actually. Also, I mean, in a sense, like you talked about subjectivity, I mean, the artist's vision brings a very subjective viewpoint to the footage and to the archive. With Kate's film, for example, which was the second clip of black and white footage, that was she took as her narrative a 1961 documentary on Barbara Hepworth. So when it talks about the woman's work, it was originally the woman artist. So in a sense, she was making a comment on the value of domesticity, of the work at home, and she took shots from a variety of sources of women at work, you know, in the supermarket, at home, and created a kind of universal woman who then sort of represented that. So in a way, she was using archive, you know, with a purpose. She had a vision and a purpose in mind.
And that is considerably removed from the original, in a way that neither of these guys or you have moved, even though you've made considerable changes.
We're in this funny position where, same with Disney Animated as well, actually. When the archive was originally created, the people, the contributors and the people recording had no idea that this medium would even exist. Like, it was something so different. Like, how on earth are we meant to attack that challenge? It is something that we definitely thought about quite a lot. Both Disney Animated, these animators being interviewed in like the 1950s, but they never knew that their audio recordings would end up on an iPad app. And the ethics around that, really interesting.
We're in the middle of a discussion at the moment. We've just about completed our policies, and that's about user-generated content and crowdsourced content. And the next version of the archive that I showed you will have user-generated content on it, and it will also allow families to upload new content to the file. So that's brought with it a whole other set of challenges, as you can imagine, about who gets permission to do that, what's allowed, what's not, how you moderate that, particularly when it's, you know, it could be thousands of entries, you know, on a very regular basis. But what we've made a decision is that we're going to turn the Visual History Archive into a community, so that that the participation in it will be very much about, its growth will be about what people want to contribute to it and how they want to help to refine it, including tagging and new layers of metadata and so forth, which will be apparent what the source is. So the source will be a layer, effectively, but will allow a much greater degree of content to be added to it. And that's been a really interesting challenge to start to work through that, and it's still ongoing now.
It's going to be an extraordinary playground for people in the future, isn't it? Are there any questions that people would like to ask of the panel at this point? I've got two at the front. If we take each of you in turn.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Stephen, you mentioned this community. Are they actually going to be able to, is it like a social network where they'll be able to talk to each other? And is it Lindsey?
Yes, yeah.
Did you have any legal issues that came up in terms of the film you were talking about, the black and white, and sort of clearing that use of the archive with a new intention? Thank you.
So to your question about will people be able to talk to each other, yes, they will within their audience group. So there's 4 audiences: scholars, educators, community, and organizations. So scholars will be able to talk to scholars, and within that, actually, students can talk to students if they are students of the scholars. And that's a particular research platform. And each of those audiences gets their own interface. So the educators can talk to educators, and they can join their classes together, so they can talk then within their broader classes as they grow. Organizations are things like museums and exhibitions and curators and so on. They'll be able to, they also have their own forum within that, and they can also share ideas and so forth, as well as do all their tagging and so forth. And then within community, it's more of a family thing. So it's about people who have an interest because they have some connection to it, and that's more of a social media platform. So it'll be based around traditional. I'm calling social media platforms traditional social media platforms. So they'll have different means by which they will join their community and participate in different ways.
Thank you.
Yes, onto the legal front. As you can imagine, we had a lot of conversations in the BBC about this project. The artists were all contracted, so they retained their IP, and BBC retained the intellectual property of the archive within the films. But what we did do was encourage them to use BBC archives, so they weren't using acquisitions or third-party material. It was BBC owned, which made things simpler because we retained the rights to say that they could use it. Were they to start using third-party archives, that would have made the project probably a lot less manageable in a sense. So, but the answer is we didn't actually have any issues, no, because we'd sort of retained it within the BBC.
I guess I meant more in terms of whether you contacted, I think you mentioned that, whether you contacted the original makers to clear how, because that was not their original intention, and whether that provided a legal nightmare for you in that sense.
I don't know if you're aware of editorial policy. It's a department within the BBC which is basically given over to guiding filmmakers, news, everyone, to obviously moderate what happens to this footage. And I'd say those were the most lengthy conversations because they did have opinions on the material and how it was being used. And ultimately, they could only guide. They did have some recommendations which we did adhere to, which the artists, had their own opinions about, but ultimately it was a BBC project, so we did have to fulfil that criteria. But in terms of those that we contacted, in terms of producers of the content that we used, everyone was actually fine with it. And I think that was a really interesting dynamic because that highlighted the difference between artists and the institution in a sense, and what is an artwork and how open that can be and how you don't have to be so prescriptive and you don't have to say this woman isn't a real woman in Kate's film, for example. I think the audience is intelligent enough to know that that is a kind of universal woman that she's created. So, but there may be others that think, no, that it should be made clear that this is a fictionalized woman and the woman that you're looking at who's pregnant, reclining on the bed, is not the woman that we're talking about. She's just an example. So all of these things were discussed, which there was a real rigor to that process, some of which I think probably frustrated everyone involved, but hopefully everyone got something out of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
The ideal solution is probably always to have Stephen's Hollywood lawyers
Yeah.
on your side whenever you want to do something.
Yeah.
Never leave home without them. Just as a brief advertising moment, BAFTA and Sheffield Doc Fest are putting out a Rights for Film Archives course on Future Learn, which begins on Monday. You can still register for that. It's completely free. I know some people in this room have already done it and spoke to me very positively about it this morning. Thank you for that. And it takes you through some of the key issues in using film footage from the origins of film until now. There's some sound legal documentation in there for your use and some explanation of how to navigate the many grey areas. So if you do feel this is of interest to you, I urge you to sign up. It's a very nice piece of online learning. Thank you. Advertisement finished at this point. Gentleman in the front, you had a question.
I suppose probably it might be Lindsey, might be the best sort of to direct this to, but do you think it's time maybe that the BBC had a kind of a policy for keeping original material? Because I know that at the moment the only requirement is to keep the final programme and an M&E mix of the final programme, and my argument's always been that that's actually far less valuable than the original material. I mean, we actually had a case with the director I'm working with at the moment where there was a film that he interview we wanted to use from or he wanted to use from a contributor who's now died, and unfortunately the interview had music all over it, and it was only shot about 10 years ago, but the rushes have been destroyed. So is there not a case that this should be added to BBC deliverable sort of specs?
Yeah, that's a big question. I have to, I know.
Whole of the BBC.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe it's a more general,
Yeah,
anyone could have a view on it. I think,
No, I could only give a personal opinion.
yes.
I mean, there are a lot of people, a lot more senior than me, who make these decisions. I have to say, from personal experience, I know that within factual, within arts especially, people do, directors, as you touched upon, do archive their own content. And I suppose, in a sense, it's a sort of paradoxical, because now with digital materials, in a sense, it was sort of easier when things were on tape, because you could put it on a shelf. Now it's just like, how many servers do you have? Where do you store it? How many expensive drives can we have to keep this material on? But yes, I mean, I would agree. I think that who knows when in future that material will become useful, and who knows who will pass away, and that archive becomes incredibly precious.
You might become famous in the future.
Yeah, but the problem is when the individual productions in the BBC keep their own material, it's not available in the central database, and so you have to. So then you're relying on going to like the Panorama producer, or if it's all centralised, then it's.
It makes no.
There should be a policy. There should be a central policy to keep stuff. Although I suppose you can't keep everything, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would say that Scotland specifically is quite good, because we're a smaller organisation. Like, we can kind of have more control over the archives, and as long as there's a good dialogue between the production team and the archive, then I think that really helps. I think where the challenges lie are when you've got a production manager, director, APs, researchers who no sooner have finished one film and they're on to the next. That sort of idea of legacy, unfortunately, sometimes goes out the window, because people are just focused on the day-to-day and what they need to do. So, yeah, I think it's a very valid question, and I do believe people are considering it and dealing with it.
There's a sort of, this is moving my personal hat on here, rather than a BBC hat on, but there's this feeling like, as individuals, we now have so much data, like so much of our own data that we can store. We have all this unlimited data in the cloud, we have our personal archives. There's this kind of expectation then on the public services that we use to also have that kind of like unlimited access, I think, as well. And I think there's maybe a user expectation that's changing. It's just kind of a reflection on the way that audiences, what they want seems to be changing. But it feels much easier now that we're used to having our own servers and our own limited gigs up in the cloud that we can, our organisation should be doing this too.
It's sometimes known by archivists as the photograph of Jesus effect. Has anyone seen this film? It's on YouTube. Go and watch it tonight. It's a delight. It's made by an archivist dealing with the fact that someone would like, from his archive, a photograph of Jesus. Such is the expectation that archives can provide unlimited, everything that was created, and have magically got whatever is needed from whatever historical period, because that's the universe that we live in, that everything is just automatically there. You just filter it through Google. Sorry, Stephen, you had something to say.
A couple of thoughts on that. I mean, you made the point not everything could be saved. Well, actually, it could. It's just data, and it can all be kept. The question is, why would we want to do that, and what are we going to do with it when we've got it? So a couple of thoughts on that. I was involved in a project called the American Archive, and it's a project to retrospectively go back and try and gather from public broadcasting whatever can be scooped up. And it was very clear that the American Archive, which is now the Library of Congress, there was no way that everything that existed in every local broadcasting station going back as long as they got it could be put in one place, because it was just first of all, too expensive and too big a job. So what actually happened was about 40,000 hours of material was put into the first tranche. And each of the stations got a chance to curate a certain amount of their content, which they thought was the best content for the last, whatever it was, 50 years, I think we went back. The last 50 years, the best content that they would like to submit to the American Archive to start. And then the idea is that can then grow, and particularly going forward then, there's the opportunity to collect much more because the repository is then created. The second issue around that then is about access, because you can dump as much as you like into the repository, but if you haven't got the time and capacity to put the metadata associated to it on it, then you're never going to retrieve it anyway. So one of the ways that we've been dealing with this, and I'll go back to Joshua Oppenheimer's project, we're actually seeing it as an extension of the creative process. So what's happening is now the films have been finished and all the rushes that exist. he and his team are deciding what the archive of that project is. So now they're going through a curatorial process to say this is in and this is not, this is in and this is not, based on what they think is most valuable from the material that they've got. So what you then end up with is effectively an archive, which is a curation of the original footage, which they may or may not keep, and it's not actually then relevant to us, but it's the decisions that they have made about what makes up the real story behind the films and the material that didn't make the cut. So we're seeing it as a collaboration between the creator in this case.
And the other stuff just gets, what happens to the other stuff? They just throw that, they just dispose of that.
Well, then that's their decision as the filmmakers, what they want to do with that. But what this is doing is giving an opportunity for at least some of the content that they have prioritized, and we're not putting a limit on that. If they want it to be all of it, it's fine. But they'll be making all sorts of decisions themselves, both from a creative and an ethical and is this and a relevance perspective, whether or not they want to include that content in what becomes the archive behind the film.
Sorry, I don't know, is there anyone, I did have one more point actually on that, which is if you have, I don't want to hog the microphone, but if you've got a project like a film has been made and you've got all the rushes or something for it, could that not just be kept under that project title? And then you're basically allowing someone later to come along and do the research and do the metadata. So it's at least it then exists.
So the Armenian Film Foundation's project that I showed you briefly there, everything's in it, including the logs, daily logs, and everything. So you can search it as if you are the filmmaker, effectively at that point. And that was a decision that was made by the owner of the archive, that everything would go into it, the multiple takes, the logs, the dailies, and all the rest of it. So you can search it as if it is the whole project. But that our policy decision is to leave each of those archives to make their own decision about how they want to curate the content into the archive in perpetuity.
And I think that is a particular gift of your organisation that perhaps yours doesn't necessarily have to make.
Well, I was just going to touch on that, because I think that's really interesting about Joshua being being responsible, as it were, for curating the archive, which I think is, on the one hand, is brilliant, and on the other hand, touching on the gentleman in the front row's point about, in 10 years' time, someone going to look for material, that might not be the material that Joshua had in his own mind when he was curating the content. And just talking from the experience of being in the BBC, quite often people are looking for shots of, a field in Kent or something, and the filmmaker, it could be the least important thing on their shoot, but maybe he had an extra, 5 beautiful shots that someone making a documentary would be keen to include. So it just raises issues, I guess, about the future and what it is.
You don't know what lens people come at it.
No, which is interesting. But I think it's valuable to have that, that vision of someone who was there at the time, kind of enforcing their curatorial vision onto it.
And I'm aware that we are moving towards the end of our time, so do start waving at me if you've got more questions. But I think it's interesting that you've just brought that back to the audience, because a lot of what we've just been discussing is in fact the core issues of any archiving. Even if you take away the word innovation, which, as I said, to me is just fundamental to using an archive. We've talked about the limits of any archive, whether it's to do with resources or a particular collecting principle, the ethics of using it, the nature of preservation, how you have to keep changing it, how the requirements change over time, the authenticity, respect of the original material versus respect for the new context. But I wonder if there is anything distinct and different that anybody on the panel or in the audience feels is changing about the way an audience understands archive in this world of the internet, where everything is automatically available, where everything is filmed by however many smartphones are in the room. And I've seen people, panel all the way to the back of the room. We're recording this. The archive created by this hour and a half alone is already vast. The world's understanding of what an archive could and should be is moving incredibly fast.
I think it's going to, user expectations is probably going to evolve to become, I think they're becoming more demanding, but increasingly more demanding. As they get used to, I often say users, I mean audience, same thing. As audiences, users get used to these recommendation engines just being standard, Amazon's recommended list, this is what you might want to buy next, or Netflix, this is what you might want to watch next. Relevance, I think, is becoming increasingly more of a demand, and why should I go sifting through, browsing through all this stuff to watch, to experience? Can't you deliver that to me? And I suppose, I mean, maybe this is more of a user direct to archive point, as opposed to talking necessarily about having a documentary maker in the middle. But users, I think, will expect it to be delivered to them more like the right place, the right time when it's most interesting. So, say for instance, I think
You're basically saying the audience of the future is very lazy.
we're just used to, they got different expectations. They're used to things being super relevant. And when you think like, what is it that drives curiosity? It's like what's relevant to me that drives my curiosity around things.
I'd like to counter that.
It's interesting that Catherine's is personal, and what you've made is the ability to have a totally personalised experience. Stephen?
I'd like to counter that. We actually made a decision that we are going to randomise results. We're not going to go by relevance, and we're not going to go by top hits. That's going to be the next version. So you won't get what the other 1,000 people just saw. You're going to get a randomised result. Second decision.
How did you reach that decision?
Because we think that by allowing, if relevance becomes the way in which we get to content, then it means that you don't get to the content which is maybe most interesting actually on a niche basis. So we didn't want the experience of one to be their experience because it's the experience of others. We want it to be their own experience. Second thing is about literacies. And what I didn't explain about the Eyewitness website is it's about digital literacy. And it's about teaching 14-year-olds how to use an archive. They work in multiple sources. There's multiple archives in there, not only our own, but the US Holocaust Museum, NIOD in Amsterdam, the Rwandan Genocide Archive. All of them are on their desktop, the US Holocaust Museum. So they've got to work responsibly within all of those, learn to search, learn to do structured search. So I just showed you the unstructured search bar. There's 5 different forms of structured search, and we force them to do structured search within the lessons that they do, so they don't just go to the Google bar, hit it, and get 1,000 answers. And then we teach them how to manage the content. So when I was talking about them mashing it and so forth, yeah, they are mashing it, but they're learning how to do so in a responsible way with new literacies that are available to them, so that when they go to another site, actually their skills and expectations are greater than the lowest common denominator. And that's right down the middle of what we're trying to do. The content is about Holocaust and genocide, it's about tolerance education, but the way in which we're teaching them is all about media literacy and responsible digital citizenship.
Interestingly, that's a complete reverse to Catherine,
I
really,
suppose
isn't
the
it?
audiences are different.
You see us moving towards a completely Googleized model where you press a button and things come to you and it will be the right thing for you, whereas it sounds to me, Stephen, like you're preserving a particular understanding of archive and being within a particular source of content.
I think we're talking about different audiences actually, so I revised my comment to a general consumer audience actually.
Okay.
The relevance will become more of an expectation, but with an education audience, very different.
But then the children that you educate now become the next set of consumers, and they're going to want to, I think that if we train them right and we give them the literacies, then they're going to become much more discerning users, and they're going to have to be, because the surfeit of content is such that they're just going to become, online dummies if we're not careful. We've got to teach them how to use their online content intelligently and to have the tools, the skills to do so.
Lindsey, with this very simplistic difference that we've pulled out between what these two have done with their historical archive use and yours with the emotional creative, do you see a difference in audiences and the way that they will want to access something that at the moment we call archive? Where do you...
Well, I guess within the context of the BBC, that remains one of the responsibilities of the BBC to curate its own archive. The Artist Project was in a sense a brilliant anomaly because we brought in 6 individual curators to bring to light archive which normally hasn't seen the light of day. But if you watch BBC 4 or you watch programmes on BBC 2, there's a huge amount of archive that surfaces within documentary, within news, like all over our public broadcasting stations every single day. So I think, and I think that content is popular, and I think it's used, I think it's increasingly going back to that notion of curation, which I do think is slightly overused, but is relevant. It's about bringing intelligent eyes onto the content and bringing it to people. And I think in instances like, you were talking about, Stephen, I think it is important to educate people to make intelligent searches. Not everyone wants to kind of have, the kind of advertising now, which is Phil Spencer, like sort of doing up a house for British Gas or whatever, you know, that kind of curious ways that things are making their way into our consciousness. So yeah, I think if that possibly answers the question, possibly not, but yeah.
I think so. We could probably squeeze in one more audience question. Lady at the front.
I had a question for Lindsey. I was wondering, when you were selecting the artists for the scheme, did you ask them to explain what subject matter they'd be interested in before? Because I know a lot of artist residency schemes like to kind of gauge what they're going to get out of it at the end, but with a thing like the BBC Archive, obviously there's so many possibilities they can't maybe tell before what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, which I wrote down this morning, and I was thinking, I think we were a bit hard on the artists because we did ask them to write a sort of summary of what they would like to do, but in retrospect, you know, I think that made it was really challenging because they had no idea. You know, it's incredibly difficult to know what's in the BBC Archive, and it's also perhaps slightly curtails them in that they're kind of coming with a vision that they then have to execute when that actually might change in the course of the residency. So some did, some came with a very precise kind of, this is what I want to do, and for others it was more a subject area or a theme. But we did ask them to tell us what they would like. It wasn't just, you know, carte blanche, and we did have a criteria based on what would you like to do and can you summarise it for us.
Innovative viewers, thank you very much. I mean, we've covered such a vast metaphysical range of topics here, and in actual fact no one has mentioned pleasure. Please don't forget that the stuff in archives is just, it's pleasurable, whether it's creative or because you learn something or because it opens your eyes to something. I think, you know, at the base of all of these projects is an intensely enjoyable experience in all sorts of different ways. And I know every archivist that I've ever worked with, that is their primary motivation for doing what they do in their completely non-dusty environments where they don't discover things because they know they were there, they put them there and they have systems for finding them again. That's what an archive does. They keep them because of the wonderful potential of this material in every single different innovative iteration that people bring to it. So I think that's what underlies all of these discussions today and why what you have to say is so fascinating. To see the content that these guys have been discussing, the films Lindsey's made are in BBC Arts Online. Easter Rising is at the Site Gallery, which is down by the showroom. If you're facing the showroom, it's just to the right. They're doing time slots of an hour at the moment. And it's 11 minutes, Easter Rising, I think. 12 minutes, sorry. So make sure you get in the queue when you get in there to make sure you can see it.
It's worth it, I promise.
It really, I've only seen a little, but it absolutely is. And the extraordinary mind-bending experience of seeing the new dimensions in testimonies in the Millennium Gallery, which you can't really miss, and is stunning and makes you think about your interaction with technology in totally different ways, as well as all of the context that we've brought to it with today's discussion. So I really urge you to see those if you can possibly fit them in. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today, and thank you especially to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.